What if I told you there was a man in Scripture who saw the future before it happened, not through visions or dreams, but through tears? A man who carried the DNA of restoration in his grief. Nehemiah was not merely rebuilding walls. He was awakening something ancient, something prophetic, something that made enemies tremble the moment broken stones began to rise. They knew this was never about construction. It was about destiny. Every gate lifted from ashes was a declaration. Every stone reset was warfare in unseen realms. What Nehemiah touched with his hands echoed across generations, and what he saw in rubble, God still wants us to see in our own lives. Bent Nehemiah's life, on the surface, looked comfortable. He lived in the palace of the most powerful empire on earth, serving King Artaxerxes of Persia. He was the cupbearer, a position of immense trust and constant danger. One sip of poisoned wine and his life would end in the king's place. Cupbearers heard secrets, lived near power, and had access few ever gained. But comfort did not dull his conscience. In the month of Kislev, during the 20th year of the king, everything shifted. His brother Hanani arrived from Judah, and Nehemiah asked the question that would change his life forever: "How is Jerusalem?" The answer shattered him. The city was broken. The walls lay in ruins. The gates were burned. The people lived in shame and fear. This was not just a city to Nehemiah. It was the place where God had set his name, the burial ground of his ancestors, the symbol of covenant identity. For more than Ebed Sitter's years it had remained this way, a living monument to defeat. When Nehemiah heard this, he did not brush it off. He sat down and wept. Days turned into mourning. Mourning turned into fasting. Fasting turned into relentless prayer. For 4 months he carried the weight of a city hundreds of miles away, wrestling with God while serving wine with steady hands. And when he prayed, he did not speak casually. He began by acknowledging who God is: great, awesome, faithful to covenant. Then he confessed sin, not just his own, but the sins of his people. He owned the failure that led to exile. And then he did something bold. He reminded God of his own promises. If the people returned, God had promised to gather them again. This was not arrogance. It was faith gripping the words of God and refusing to let go. Finally, he asked for one thing: favor before this man, the king. Amend. When the month of Nisan came, Nehemiah's face betrayed the burden he had carried for months. Sadness before the king could mean death. But the king noticed and asked why. Fear flooded Nehemiah, but he answered with wisdom, speaking of his ancestors' graves rather than naming Jerusalem outright. Then came the moment that would define everything. The king asked, "What do you want?" In that split second, Nehemiah prayed silently and then spoke boldly. He asked to be sent to rebuild the city. The request was outrageous, and yet the king agreed. Not only that, he granted letters of protection, access to royal timber, and full authority. Nehemiah knew exactly why. The gracious hand of God was on him. When Nehemiah arrived in Jerusalem, he waited. 3 days passed in silence. Then, under cover of night, he rode out with a small group to inspect the walls himself. He needed to see the truth before he spoke. The devastation was worse than he imagined. Rubble blocked the paths. Gates were reduced to ash. In places, the destruction was so complete he had to climb over broken stones. Yet he was not discouraged. He had seen enough. When the time came, he gathered the leaders and spoke plainly. The city lay in disgrace, but it didn't have to stay that way. God's hand was with them. The king supported the work. Hope ignited. A people who had lived among ruins for generations suddenly said, "Let us start rebuilding." Everyone had a role. Priests worked alongside merchants, goldsmiths lifted stones, even daughters joined in the work. Families rebuilt the sections nearest their homes, strengthening what would protect their own children. Names were recorded, contributions mattered. Community was restored as the wall rose, but opposition followed immediately. Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem mocked, threatened, and accused. They tried ridicule, then intimidation, then violence. Nehemiah responded with prayer and preparation. Builders worked with one hand and held weapons in the other. Trumpets stood ready to rally defenders. Fear was met with faith. Exhaustion was met with resolve. "Our God will fight for us," Nehemiah declared. When external threats failed, internal corruption surfaced. Wealthy Jews were exploiting the poor, charging interest, seizing land, even enslaving children. Nehemiah burned with righteous anger, but he acted with wisdom. He confronted the nobles publicly, demanded restitution, and bound them by oath before God. Then he set the example himself. For 12 years as governor, he refused the allowances others had taken. He fed hundreds at his own table and added no burden to a struggling people. His leadership was not about privilege, but sacrifice. Even when the wall neared completion, deception intensified. False letters accused him of rebellion. Invitations lured him away from the work. False prophets tried to trap him into sin. Each time, Nehemiah discerned the strategy. Each time, he refused. "I am doing a great work and cannot come down," he said, and he prayed simply, "Now strengthen my hands." In just 52 days, the wall was finished. A structure broken for over a century stood restored in less than 2 months. The enemies were shaken. They realized this was not human achievement. It was the work of God. Fear fell on them, and confidence drained away, but restoration did not stop with stones. Gates were set. Leaders of integrity were appointed. The people gathered. Ezra read the law aloud from morning until midday. The Levites explained it clearly, and understanding pierced hearts. The people wept, then rejoiced. They celebrated, repented, confessed, worshipped, and entered into covenant. They did not just rebuild a city, they rebuilt their identity. What Nehemiah saw in ruins became a revelation of what God could restore. Walls were only the beginning. Something eternal had been unlocked, and the story, just like the work, was far from finished. After the people bound themselves to the covenant, the weight of what they had promised settled over the city like a holy silence. This was no emotional moment meant to fade with time. They had put their names on obedience. They had sworn with full awareness that life would change. The law would no longer be something heard occasionally. It would shape marriages, economics, worship, rest, and identity. They pledged not to blend their devotion with surrounding nations, not because of ethnicity, but because compromise had always been the doorway to collapse. They committed to honor the Sabbath, refusing to buy or sell on the day God had set apart, even if it cost them profit or convenience. They agreed to support the house of God, to bring offerings, wood, firstfruits, and tithes, so worship would never again fall into neglect. This was a people deciding that survival was not enough. They wanted faithfulness. Life slowly began to settle inside the rebuilt walls. Houses were restored. The city that once echoed with shame began to fill with voices again. Yet Jerusalem was still underpopulated, so families were chosen by lot to move into the city, 1 out of every 10. It was not glamorous. Living in Jerusalem meant vulnerability, responsibility, and constant watchfulness. Those who went were honored because they volunteered to carry the weight of rebuilding a nation's heart, not just its defense. The city was no longer just protected by walls, but by people willing to live with purpose. Generations were remembered. Names were preserved, lineages mattered, not for pride, but for continuity. This was a people reconnecting with who they were and where they came from. The priests were organized. The Levites were assigned their duties. Worship was structured so that praise would not fade again into neglect. The rhythms of devotion returned. Daily offerings, songs, service, reverence. Order replaced chaos. Intention replaced drift. Yet, even as reform took shape, time passed, and Nehemiah eventually returned to Persia, back to the palace where his journey had begun. Years later, when he came back to Jerusalem, what he found grieved him deeply. Old habits had crept back in. Promises had loosened. Compromise had found new cracks to slip through. Tobiah, the very enemy who had mocked and opposed the rebuilding, had been given a room inside the temple courts. The place meant for offerings had been turned into a residence for an adversary. Nehemiah's reaction was swift and fierce. He threw Tobiah's belongings out of the temple, purified the rooms, and restored them to their intended purpose. The house of God would not be shared with what opposed God. Bands. He discovered that the Levites had been neglected again, forced to leave their duties to work fields just to survive. The Sabbath was being treated like any other day, markets bustling, merchants trading, prophets prioritized over obedience. Intermarriage had returned, and with it, confusion of language and identity among the children. Nehemiah confronted it all. He rebuked leaders, shut city gates before the Sabbath, stationed guards, drove away merchants, and reminded the people why the exile had happened in the first place. His leadership in this final phase was not gentle, but it was necessary. Restoration, he understood, must be guarded or it will erode. Again and again, Nehemiah prayed short, piercing prayers. Remember me, my God, not for fame, not for legacy, but for faithfulness. He knew reform was never a single event. It was a continual battle against forgetfulness, comfort, and compromise. Walls could be rebuilt in 52 days, but hearts required constant vigilance. And this is where the story presses forward into every generation that reads it. Nehemiah's work did not end with stone and mortar. It revealed a pattern that repeats wherever God calls people to rebuild what has been broken. The burden begins with seeing ruins that others have learned to ignore. Then comes weeping. Not performative sorrow, but grief deep enough to change direction. Prayer follows long before action. Planning waits on God. Courage steps forward at the right moment. Opposition rises, always. Mockery, fear, exhaustion, internal conflict, they come in waves. Leadership is tested not by applause, but by pressure. And through it all, the work advances not because conditions are easy, but because hands are strengthened by God. Nehemiah shows us that restoration is never only external. God rebuilds cities by rebuilding people. He secures walls by restoring worship. He silences enemies by awakening obedience. And the most dangerous threat is never the voices outside the gates, but the compromises allowed inside the heart. The stones Nehemiah lifted still speak, the gates still testify, and the question they ask has never changed. When you look at the ruins before you, will you see only rubble, or will you see what God is ready to restore? Next, before the ink on the covenant had even dried, the people understood that obedience would not live only in words. It would reshape their calendars, their fields, their money, and their worship. Every seventh year, they promised to let the land rest, to release debts, and to trust that provision came from God rather than relentless labor. Markets would fall silent on the Sabbath, profit would pause, faith would speak louder than fear. This was not symbolic devotion. It was costly trust, woven into everyday life. Panja, They also took responsibility for the house of God itself. No longer would worship survive on leftovers or emotion alone. Each year, they committed a portion of their wealth so that the temple would never again fall into neglect. Bread would always be set before the Lord. Offerings would never stop. Sabbaths, new moons, appointed festivals, all would be honored with consistency. A system was established, so worship would continue not only in moments of revival, but through ordinary days, and even the practical details were. Lots were cast to decide which families would bring wood for the altar, ensuring that the fire of sacrifice would never go out. Nothing was left to chance. Devotion was planned, scheduled, protected. Comdienst. They brought the first and best of everything: grain, fruit, wine, oil, livestock, even the firstborn, into the storerooms of God's house. The Levites received the tithe so they could serve without distraction. And over it all, the people made one simple declaration that carried enormous weight. They would not neglect the house of their God. Everything in the covenant pointed to that single resolve. Yet while worship was being restored, another problem quietly lingered. Jerusalem, though rebuilt, was still largely empty. The walls stood strong, the gates were repaired, the covenant was signed, but most people lived elsewhere. Life had gone on during the years of ruin. Families had settled in outlying towns, built homes, planted fields, started businesses. Moving into Jerusalem meant sacrifice. It meant vulnerability. It meant starting over in a city that was still a target. So lots were cast again, and 1 out of every 10 families was chosen to move into the holy city. But something beautiful happened alongside obligation. Some people volunteered, and those who willingly left comfort for calling were publicly honored, because they understood that a restored city needed more than walls. It needed people willing to live at the center of God's purposes. Names were recorded. Tribes were listed. Priests, Levites, gatekeepers, temple servants, all took their places. Most of the population remained in their ancestral towns, while Jerusalem slowly filled with those tasked to carry its spiritual weight. Even the Levites were spread throughout the land, so worship and instruction would reach the people wherever they lived. Order replaced chaos. Generations were remembered next. The priestly lines were traced back to the first return from exile under Zerubbabel. High priests were listed carefully, showing an unbroken line of spiritual responsibility from the past to the present. These records mattered. They anchored the people in continuity. They reminded them that they were not inventing faith anew, but stepping back into a calling interrupted by exile. The Levites were organized according to ancient patterns established by David. Worship followed rhythms older than destruction itself. Then came the day no one thought they would live to see. The wall was finished, not just standing, but ready to be dedicated. Levites were summoned from every surrounding village. Musicians gathered. Instruments echoed through the streets. Before celebration began, purification took place. The people, the gates, even the wall itself were ceremonially cleansed. This was not a party. It was a consecration. Nehemiah then did something unforgettable. He placed leaders on top of the wall and divided the singers into 2 great choirs. One moved in one direction, the other in the opposite, both walking along the very stones that had once been rubble. Trumpets sounded, cymbals clashed, voices rose. The wall that enemies mocked now carried songs of thanksgiving. The city rang with praise. People outside Jerusalem could hear it. Women rejoiced. Children rejoiced. Sacrifices were offered. And the text is careful to say this joy was not manufactured. God himself gave it. What had been rebuilt by sweat and struggle was sealed with divine gladness. That same day, Systems were put in place to sustain what had begun. Trustworthy men were appointed to oversee storerooms. Contributions were organized. Priests, Levites, musicians, and gatekeepers received what they needed. Worship returned to the patterns established centuries earlier. Israel supported those who served, and service continued without interruption. But restoration is fragile when left unguarded. Nehemiah eventually returned to Persia to serve the king again. Time passed, and when he finally came back to Jerusalem, what he found was devastating. Compromise had crept in quietly. An enemy who once mocked the rebuilding now lived inside the temple complex itself, occupying rooms meant for offerings. The Levites had been abandoned again, forced back into fields just to survive. The Sabbath had become another business day. Markets overflowed. Merchants camped outside the gates. Identity was dissolving as intermarriage blurred language, culture, and faith. Nehemiah did not respond gently. He responded decisively. He threw the enemy's furniture out of the temple with his own hands. He purified the rooms. He restored what had been defiled. He confronted leaders, demanded accountability, and reinstated the Levites. He shut the city gates before the Sabbath and posted guards. He threatened merchants until they stopped coming. He rebuked nobles and reminded them that these very sins had once destroyed their nation. And when he saw families compromising the future of Israel, he reacted with fierce urgency, appealing to history, even to Solomon himself, as proof that unchecked compromise leads to collapse. Again and again his prayers were short and raw. Remember me, my God, not for praise, not for recognition, but for faithfulness. Now. And the story presses forward, unfinished, carrying a tension that refuses to resolve too neatly, inviting the next chapter to be written, because even after everything Nehemiah confronted, even after the cleansing, the rebukes, the reforms, and the tears, the deeper struggle still lingered beneath the surface. The walls could be repaired again. Systems could be reset. Leaders could be replaced. But the human heart was slower to rebuild than stone. Nehemiah understood something most generations learn too late. That revival does not fail loudly. It fades quietly. The people had not openly rejected God. They still gathered. They still spoke the language of covenant. But familiarity had dulled reverence. Obedience had become optional where it once felt urgent. What began as small exceptions slowly grew into habits, and habits into patterns. Nehemiah saw that danger clearly. It wasn't the enemies outside the gates that troubled him most anymore. It was the forgetfulness within. He moved through the city like a watchman who refused to sleep. Every compromise felt personal, not because his authority was challenged, but because the cost was always the same. Neglect always back towards every ignored Sabbath, every withheld tithe, every diluted identity carried echoes of ruins, chains, and silence. He was not reacting emotionally. He was remembering history, yet beneath his firmness was grief. This was the city he had wept for in a distant palace. These were the people whose names he had carried in prayer, night after night. He had risked everything to stand before a king, to rebuild what others had given up on. And now he saw how easily people drifted once the urgency faded. Success had made them comfortable. Comfort had made them careless. Still, Nehemiah did not walk away. He reorganized again. He purified again. He reminded again. Leadership, he knew, was not proven in beginnings but in endurance. Anyone could lead during celebration. You could stand firm when enthusiasm. So he pressed on, tightening what had loosened, restoring what had slipped, guarding what had been entrusted. And woven through all of it was prayer. Brief, urgent, almost breathless. He did not pause for eloquence. His words rose like arrows. Remember, see, act. He placed no confidence in perfect systems or permanent reform. His hope rested in a God who remained faithful even when people wavered. Advanced. What emerges from these final movements is not a flawless ending, but a painfully honest one. A rebuilt city, still needing vigilance, a restored people, still capable of forgetting, a leader who understands that faithfulness is not a finish line, but a daily stand against erosion. Nehemiah's story does not close with triumph alone, but with tension between devotion and distraction, obedience and ease, remembrance and neglect. And that tension lingers, stretching beyond ancient Jerusalem, reaching into every generation that believes rebuilding is the end rather than the beginning, whispering a question that refuses to be answered too quickly, asking whether what has been restored will be guarded, whether what has been rebuilt will be honored, whether the fire that has been reignited will be protected when no one is watching, when the walls are standing, when the songs have faded, and when the work no longer feels urgent, but the calling remains.